Hey everyone. It's good to have you here tonight. Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always strange to think that while I speak about the chill of English twilight in 1942, someone might be listening from a warm room across the ocean. Different worlds, and yet, maybe somehow, we're both sitting in the same quiet darkness. Anyway, let's go back. To the airfield at dusk. To the place where I first learned how silence could hum like an engine. The base sat low among the fields of East Anglia, flat land that stretched forever, like the sky itself had fallen and decided to rest there. There was mud everywhere. Mud in our boots, on the wheels of the bicycles we used to get around, and thick on the sleeves of our flight suits. When the wind blew in from the North Sea, it brought the smell of oil and wet grass, and sometimes faintly the ghost of salt from the coast. I remember the sound most of all. That deep, trembling thunder of the Merlin engines warming up in the distance. It was never just noise, it was life, fear, purpose. Every man on that base could tell which crew was preparing for takeoff just by listening. The sound told us who was leaving that night, and if we were unlucky, who wouldn't come back. They called me Flight Sergeant, though the title still feels strange when I think of it. I was 21. And it all still felt like an adventure then. The kind of story people might tell someday, about bravery and missions over Germany, about fire and smoke and the roar of courage. But those stories never tell you about the quiet moments. The waiting. The smell of burning fuel mixing with tea and cigarettes. The laughter that always sounded too loud, like everyone was trying to drown out a thought they didn't want to have. My first evening there was painted in strange light. The sun was sinking behind the hangars, staining the clouds in deep orange and gray. Crewmen moved like shadows, carrying bombs on little trucks, loading them one by one beneath the belly of a black Avro Lancaster. It looked enormous, patient, almost alive. You could see the dust swirl under its wings as if the aircraft itself was breathing, waiting. Someone once said those bombers had souls, born from fear and forged from steel. At the time, I thought it was superstition. Later, I wasn't so sure. We were gathered outside the mess hall, mugs in hand, talking about nothing. That was how men prepared for death, by pretending it didn't exist. Someone told a joke about the cooks burning the sausages again, and everyone laughed, though no one found it funny. Behind us, the loudspeaker crackled. The operations officer's voice came through, calm and clipped. Briefing in 15 minutes. All crews report. That was it. The sound that ended conversations, that made the air feel heavier. You'd see it in everyone's eyes, the sudden shift from boy to soldier. Some would stub out their cigarettes carefully, as if the last few seconds of smoke might still keep them safe. Others would take a deep breath and exhale slowly, their lips moving silently, whispering the same prayer they'd whispered before every flight. And then we'd walk. The briefing room was a strange kind of chapel. The smell of chalk, damp wool, and nervous sweat. On the wall hung the map of Europe, covered in strings and colored pins. That night, the line stretched east, over the Channel, over the low Black Sea, and far beyond into enemy territory. It was just another red thread on the board, but for us, it meant hours of darkness and uncertainty. We'd trace it with our eyes, memorizing the landmarks we'd never see from the ground. The squadron leader stood by the map, pointer in hand, his face ghostly pale under the single hanging lamp. His voice was calm, precise, too calm. Target for tonight is Bremen. Weather clear over the North Sea, scattered flak over the city. Expected enemy fighter activity high. Altitude, 18,000 feet. Bomb load, 4,000 pounds. There was a long pause. Then he said softly, "Good luck, gentlemen." And that was that. Luck. As if that word alone could guide a heavy machine through fire and searchlights. I remember walking to the plane after the briefing. The night had fallen completely by then. The runway lights were dimmed, just faint glimmers through the mist. You could see the crews moving like silent ghosts, climbing into their aircraft. Each bomber crouched like a great black beast, its bomb bay closed, its heart beating slow and steady. The air tasted of frost and smoke. My crew was waiting by our Lancaster. 7 of us in total. There was Morgan, the navigator, a quiet man from Liverpool who carried a lucky coin in his pocket. Reed, the rear gunner, barely 19, always grinning, even when terrified. Thompson, the engineer, who never spoke of home. And the others, each one of them bound together by that invisible thread of shared fear. We never said much before takeoff. Words felt useless then. A nod, a pat on the shoulder, that was enough. When the engine started, the ground shook beneath us. The cockpit glowed in dim red light. I slid my hands over the controls, feeling the vibration through the metal. The tower's voice came over the radio. Lancaster K2, cleared for takeoff. I looked at the runway ahead, a thin ribbon of light swallowed by darkness, and thought of home, of fields and sunlight and silence. Then the throttle went forward. The engines roared. The wheels lifted. And we were in the sky. That was the first night I truly understood what it meant to leave the world behind. They say a bomber was only as strong as its crew. You could have the best engines, the sharpest instruments, the most precise bomb sights, but without the 7 men inside working as one, it was just a shell of metal and fuel waiting to fall. When I think back on those nights, I don't remember the missions first. I remember the faces, the voices, the way they looked in the red glow of the cockpit light, their eyes half shut with exhaustion but still alive, still burning quietly with the same stubborn will that kept the plane in the air. There were 7 of us on K2, our Lancaster. 7 strangers who somehow became something like brothers. Morgan was our navigator. He came from Liverpool, but his voice carried no accent when he spoke over the intercom, just calm precision, even when the flak was bursting all around. He had a coin he always rubbed before takeoff, a worn silver half-crown that had belonged to his father. He said it was for luck, but I think it was more of a promise, that he'd come back and hand it to someone when the war was done. He used to mark tiny stars on his map for every city we flew over. Just so I don't forget where we've been, he said once. But I think it was so he could remember the ones we lost, too. Then there was Reed, the rear gunner. Only 19, with a grin too wide for the world he'd fallen into. He was the youngest of us, and we treated him like a kid brother. The rear turret was the loneliest place on the aircraft, a glass bubble at the very back, cut off from everyone else, with only the cold wind and the stars for company. Reed used to hum songs through the intercom, especially when things got tense. Once, during a particularly rough night over Cologne, he started singing quietly, a half-whispered tune about the moon and home. We were all terrified, watching the flak bloom around us like black flowers, and there he was, singing. When we landed, I told him he was mad. He just smiled and said, "If I can hear my own song, it means I'm still alive." Thompson was the flight engineer, a quiet man from Kent, built like an oak. He'd served on cargo ships before the war and always smelled faintly of machine oil. He never spoke of family, never wrote letters, and no one knew if he even had anyone waiting. But he treated that aircraft like it was his child. He could tell from a single vibration if an engine was about to fail. More than once, that sense saved us. I once saw him mid-flight, bleeding from his arm after a burst of shrapnel, still adjusting the throttles with his good hand, whispering to the engines like they could hear him. Davis was our bomb aimer, sharp-tongued, clever, and superstitious to the core. He'd never step on cracks in the concrete, never whistle in the plane, and always placed his gloves in the same order on the table before takeoff. "Order in small things brings luck in big ones," he used to say. When the bomb doors opened and the blackness below yawned wide, Davis would lean forward, eyes on the crosshairs, murmuring the coordinates like a prayer. After every run, he'd close the sight gently, as if tucking something to sleep. Then there was Cooper, the wireless operator, our link to the world outside that dark, endless sky. His job was to keep the radio alive through static and interference, through German jamming signals that hissed like snakes in our ears. He had this uncanny ability to stay calm no matter what. Once, Our intercom went dead for 15 minutes over the channel. In total silence, he sat there with a pencil between his teeth, patching wires, tapping codes, and smiling faintly. "She'll talk again," he muttered, and she did. Finally, there was Bennett mid-upper gunner, the opposite of Reed in every way. Reed was all youth and laughter. Bennett was heavy silence and narrowed eyes. He'd flown in the desert before joining Bomber Command. Never spoke much, but when he did, it carried weight. The rumor was that he'd lost someone back in North Africa, maybe a brother, maybe more. Sometimes, when the plane leveled out and the sky was quiet, he'd look up at the stars through his turret glass and just stare. I never asked what he was thinking. Some thoughts are meant to stay unspoken at that altitude. And then there was me, the pilot, the one who was supposed to bring them home. That's what they told you in training, that a bomber pilot wasn't just flying a machine, he was carrying 7 lives. And every time I touched the yoke, I could feel that weight pressing through my gloves. In the mess hall, we were just boys. Joking, drinking tea that tasted like metal, playing cards on crates of ammunition. But once the engine started, something shifted. Each man became a part of the machine, a pulse in its body. When we flew, we moved like one organism, hearts synced to the same rhythm of propellers and flak bursts. There was a kind of comfort in that. The strange, cold comfort of unity in danger. Outside, death was waiting, invisible, unpredictable. But inside that plane, for a few hours at least, everything had meaning. Every sound mattered. Every glance, every tap on the shoulder. Sometimes, when we returned from missions, we'd sit together on the grass near the runway, watching the others land. We'd count the lights in the sky, waiting for familiar silhouettes to emerge from the darkness. Not all of them did. Those were the hardest moments, the quiet ones. When engines stopped and all you could hear was the distant ticking of cooling metal, and someone would realize a certain aircraft hadn't come back. We never said their names right away. It was as if saying them too soon would make it real. Someone would light a cigarette, someone else would pour a cup of tea they wouldn't drink. And then, after a while, someone would murmur, maybe they diverted to another base. But we all knew what that meant. The next morning, their bunks would still be made, their mugs still half full, their maps still pinned to the wall. And then the mechanics would begin cleaning the empty hangar, preparing for the next crew. You never get used to that kind of absence. You just learn to walk around it. The first time I flew over the continent, I didn't know if I was terrified or exhilarated. Probably both. The kind of feeling that squeezes your chest until it hurts, and at the same time makes your fingers itch to grip the controls tighter. We had taken off just after midnight. The airfield had disappeared behind us in a haze of mist and the low hum of engines. Beneath, East Anglia sprawled like a patchwork quilt of fields and hedgerows. The moonlight danced on the metal skin of our Lancaster, and I remember thinking how fragile it all looked, how fragile we were. Morgan, sitting beside me, traced the route over the map again, whispering the waypoints to himself. Reed, in the rear turret, hummed a low tune, something about Liverpool streets and childhood laughter. Thompson checked the engines for the 3rd time, muttering to himself, hands steady even as mine shook slightly on the yoke. Davis, with his bomb sight ready, tapped the glass like he was coaxing it to tell him the secrets of the city below. We crossed the channel in silence, the water black and endless beneath us. Stars shimmered above like distant fires, and for a moment, it was almost peaceful. Then the first searchlights swept across the sky. They cut through the darkness like pale fingers, probing for our shape, our shadow. Somewhere far below, the anti-aircraft gun started, a staccato of fire that shook the earth and made our bodies vibrate in the seats. "Brace," Thompson muttered. We'd practiced for this, of course. Drills and warnings and repetition. But nothing prepared you for the first burst of flak. A deafening whine, a sudden shudder through the plane, sparks like fireflies dancing along the wings. My hands gripped the yoke until my knuckles went white. We stayed together as a crew, each of us performing our roles instinctively. Morgan called out directions. Reed tracked shadows above, twitching in his turret. Davis focused on the city lights that were slowly creeping closer, the streets he'd never walk, the buildings that would never forgive our visit. Then the bombs were ready. I remember that moment in slow motion. The bay doors opened with a heavy creak. Below us, Bremen glimmered in patches of orange and black, streets intersecting like arteries, the river cutting through it like a dark vein. I thought about the people down there, walking to work, sleeping in beds, never knowing the shadow that passed overhead. And then, release. The bombs fell with a sound I can still hear if I close my eyes, a soft mechanical sigh, and then nothing but distant thunder. I looked at Morgan. His face was pale, but calm. "Done," he said simply. I nodded, though nothing could sum up what we'd just done. The return flight was tense. The German night fighters were waiting, prowling like wolves, their engines a low, predatory growl. Tracer rounds stitched the air around us, white streaks that could end your life in an instant. Reed fired back when he could, his turret a small, defiant island of resistance. I remember thinking how strange it was, to be alive, to be moving through fire and steel, and to know that a single miscalculation could erase everything. Somewhere over the North Sea, silence fell again. We were tired, shaking, hearts hammering, yet there was a strange exhilaration. We had survived the night. For now. When we landed, the airfield was quiet. The ground crew cheered softly, the night still alive with the smell of fuel and burnt oil. We climbed out of the Lancaster, legs trembling, and for a moment, just stared at the dark sky. It seemed vast and indifferent, the stars watching, unblinking, as if judging us for what we had done. Back in the mess hall, nobody said much. Tea was poured, cigarettes lit. We looked at one another, understanding without words. We were changed. The first mission does that. It teaches you about fear, yes, but also about trust, and the strange bond between men flying through the same night, under the same threats. That night, I lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engines outside. I thought about home, about the streets I had walked as a boy, about my mother perhaps dreaming, unaware that I was now flying through a war. Sleep didn't come easily. Flak and tracer rounds and the shadows of burned cities haunted my mind. But in those hours, I also felt alive in a way I never had before. Because you can't appreciate life without having faced its fragility. And that fragility, that knowledge of just how close the sky can be to death, it stays with you. Always. The mornings after a mission were always strange. There was a certain emptiness in the air, as if the night had drained the world of sound and color, leaving only a hollow quiet behind. We would drag ourselves from the bunks, faces pale, muscles aching, and yet the routine demanded movement. The base didn't stop because we were tired. Engines still needed maintenance, aircraft still needed inspection, and somewhere, another crew would be heading into the darkness before the sun had fully risen. Breakfast in the mess hall was a subdued affair. The usual clatter of mugs and spoons seemed muted, as if everyone's energy had been siphoned into the night sky hours earlier. Tea tasted bitter that morning, but you drank it anyway, because the warmth reminded you that you were still here, still breathing, still part of something. Conversations were low, careful, each word measured. No one liked to dwell on what had happened overhead. The dead weren't discussed until they were gone from our sight entirely, and even then there were whispers, not names. Between raids, life on the airfield existed in a sort of limbo. We would walk along the edge of the runways, watching hangars gleaming under the weak sunlight, listening to the soft groans of the cooling engines. There was beauty in it, the way the metal reflected the morning, the way dew clung to the grass like tiny jeweled ghosts. But it was a fragile beauty, a temporary reprieve, because night would come again, and with it, the sky that waited to remind us how little control we truly had. In those hours, small rituals mattered more than ever. Morgan would sit with a pencil and map, tracing routes we had flown, noting towns and rivers and points of interest, almost obsessively. He said it kept his mind sharp, but I knew it was also a way to anchor himself, to feel the world beneath our wings, to remember it in case the sky decided otherwise. Reed, meanwhile, found a quiet corner and tried to sleep, head resting against a crate. Sometimes he would mumble fragments of a song under his breath, a memory of Liverpool, of home, of something safe and untouched by bombs. Letters arrived sporadically. Some were from mothers and fathers, sisters and sweethearts. Others were circulars from the government, telling us we were doing our duty, that the war would end one day. I had written a letter that I never sent, carefully folding the paper and hiding it in the lining of my flight suit. Words that seemed too heavy for someone else to bear. Words meant for a memory of myself, if I ever made it back. The engineers worked tirelessly on the aircraft, polishing metal, checking engines, replacing parts that had been scorched by flak or fatigue. Thompson would talk to them quietly, often working long after the rest of us had gone to our bunks. He had a sort of reverence for the machines, treating them almost like living beings. I remember once seeing him kneeling beside a propeller, muttering to it, as if apologizing for the risks we had imposed on it in the night. During these hours, the tension lingered. It was never far from our thoughts. Even in laughter, in casual conversation, in the dull routine of maintenance and paperwork, the sky above was always waiting. And sometimes, if you closed your eyes, you could almost hear it calling, a low, humming warning that another mission would come, that the dark was not yet done with us. We would walk the perimeter of the airfield in pairs, silent but aware of each other. The frost in early spring made our breath visible, curling in small clouds before being carried away by the wind. We talked about small things, football matches back home, what we would do after the war, which pubs we would visit first. We joked, of course. Humor was a lifeline, a way to remind ourselves that we were more than just instruments of destruction in the night sky. Yet, for all the small comforts, there was always a shadow. The sound of engines starting in the distance, a single propeller chopping through the cold morning, was enough to make your stomach tighten. A single aircraft departing was a reminder of the danger, of the uncertainty that hung over each of us like a storm cloud. We learned to move slowly, deliberately, savoring quiet moments because they were rare and fleeting. A sunlit morning, a cup of warm tea, the laughter of a friend, these were luxuries in a life dictated by the night. At times, I would find myself wandering near the river that cut across the base, the water dark and still, reflecting the sky in shards of light. I would watch it flow hypnotized, thinking about the countless miles it had traveled, just as I would soon, miles above enemy territory. The thought of returning safely to these banks seemed almost fantastical, a promise the war might not keep. We discovered the small joys wherever we could. A handwritten note tucked into a locker, a rare chocolate bar passed between friends, a letter from home that arrived unexpectedly. Even the mundane, brushing frost from your goggles, adjusting your gloves, checking the fit of your oxygen mask, became ritual, a reminder that survival depended on attention to detail. And through all of this, there was a rhythm. A cadence that defined life between raids, sleep, brief meals, maintenance, letters, walks, quiet reflection. It was a life on pause, yet intensely alive. Each breath, each heartbeat, each glance at a comrade carried weight, because the sky above always demanded more. We knew the night would come again. We knew the engines would roar and the flak would bloom. But for these precious hours, we lived. And that was all we could do. There is a sound I will never forget. A sound that has haunted me long after the war ended, long after the engines themselves fell silent. It is the sound of 7 Merlin engines coming to life in the dim light of a winter morning, their throaty growl rolling across the tarmac, vibrating through your chest, through your bones, until you feel as if you are not standing on solid ground at all, but floating somewhere between earth and sky. That sound was both comfort and terror. When the engines were cold, sitting idle in the hangar, there was a tension in the air, a waiting. You could sense it in the way the mechanics walked, slow and careful, tools in hand. A bomber was alive even when it was silent. The weight of it, the sheer presence, was enough to make your pulse quicken. Morgan, our navigator, swore he could tell a plane's mood by its engines. A humming that was smooth and steady meant everything was in order. A shudder or rasping growl could signal trouble, an oil leak, a misfiring cylinder, a warning hidden in vibration. He said it was like listening to a heartbeat. And, after a few missions, I began to believe him. There were legends among the crews about engines and machines. They said a bomber would recognize its crew, in some strange mystical way. It would respond to a pilot's touch, warn of danger, or if betrayed, rebel mid-flight. At first, I laughed. I had to, because the thought of superstition in a mechanical marvel was almost absurd. But then, after hours in the dark sky, engines whining and propellers slicing the night, I began to wonder. Perhaps it wasn't superstition at all. Perhaps it was a deep bond born from fear, necessity, and the hours spent together, chasing the same horizon, bound to each other by metal and sky. The first time I felt it, I was alone in the cockpit, climbing through cloud over the North Sea. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough to outline the waves below. The engine's hum was steady, almost melodic, but then it shivered. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, ran through the airframe. I gripped the yoke tighter, adjusted the throttles, and tried to coax the machine forward. It responded immediately, settling into a smooth rhythm once more. I swear I felt it then, not just metal, not just mechanics, but something else. Something aware. Something alive. Reed, in the rear turret, often spoke to his guns as if they had feelings. "You've got this," he'd whisper. When flak erupted and tracer rounds stitched the sky, he muttered encouragements to the turret, patting the glass as if it could hear him. The crew joked about it, of course. But there was a strange reverence in the air, a collective belief that these machines were not just tools, but guardians in their own right. The engineers shared their own rituals. Thompson would kneel by the port engine, inspecting the oil lines, his fingers brushing over the metal as if tracing a living vein. He never spoke while he did it. It was prayer in silence. The mechanics, too, moved with a careful rhythm, listening, tapping, adjusting, coaxing life into the machines. Every adjustment, every twist of a wrench, every hum of the motors carried meaning, carried responsibility. When we climbed into the bombers, preparing for night raids, the sound of engines was our constant companion. At first, it was frightening. The vibration in the cockpit, the roar in the wings, the deep, insistent pulse under our feet, it all reminded us how vulnerable we were. But then, over the weeks, it became a kind of music. A song that told us we were alive, that we were together, that the night sky was ours to navigate, if only for a few hours. There was also a darker side. Engines could betray you. A misfire, a sputter, a sudden stall, and suddenly, the comforting hum became a harbinger of death. I remember one night, over northern Germany, when our port engine coughed violently. The vibration shook the aircraft, throwing tools and loose papers across the cockpit. Reed swore softly, Thompson cursed under his breath, and Morgan's hands moved over the charts with frantic precision. I gripped the yoke as if my life depended on it, which it did, coaxing the aircraft higher, fighting the shuddering, whispering apologies aloud for reasons I cannot explain. Afterward, when the engine settled back into its deep, steady song, we were silent. None of us laughed. None of us spoke. We simply understood that the sound of engines was more than mechanical. It was our lifeline, our pulse, our fragile link to life. And in those quiet moments after landing, when the bomber's engines cooled and ticked softly in the hangar, there was a strange sadness. Because each tick, each faint vibration fading into silence, reminded us of the fleeting nature of it all. The plane that carried us safely tonight might not carry another crew tomorrow. The sky we navigated was merciless, and yet in its roaring engines, there was intimacy, a secret language shared between man and machine. Even now, decades later, I can hear it sometimes. A distant hum, carried on the wind, in the wrong pitch or rhythm, and I am back in the cockpit, flying through black nights over foreign fields. The engines do not forget. And neither do we. Flying over Berlin for the first time was like stepping into another world. A city that glowed beneath us with the unnatural fire of war, streets stretched like arteries illuminated by bombs and searchlights. and the night itself seemed heavier, as if it bore witness to every act of destruction unfolding below. We approached from the west, our Lancaster gliding silently through the high-altitude darkness. The air was thin, bitterly cold, and the breath in my oxygen mask came out in a sharp white mist. Morgan was beside me, leaning over the charts, tracing our course with a finger gloved in leather. "Keep her steady," he murmured, voice tight with concentration. I nodded, my hand steady on the controls, though my stomach knotted with anticipation and dread. Below, the city pulsed with light, a stark contrast to the muted world we had left behind. Searchlights stabbed upward, slicing through clouds like skeletal fingers, probing the sky for shadows. Occasionally, bursts of anti-aircraft fire erupted, orange and green flares blooming and fading in rapid succession, like the city itself was exhaling fire and smoke. Tracer rounds arced and hissed through the night, some close enough to make Reed duck in his turret. The bomber's engines hummed in response to my touch, steady and faithful, their vibrations a small comfort amid the chaos. Every decision mattered: altitude, speed, course corrections. One slip, one miscalculation, and the aircraft could be shredded by flak, or a fighter could find its mark in the fuselage. Davis leaned forward in the bomb aimer's sight, eyes narrowed, calculating, whispering coordinates under his breath. "The target is just ahead," he said, voice quiet, almost reverent. We passed over the main railway yards, their tracks glinting like silver snakes in the moonlight, and then over the factories that churned out instruments of war we could barely comprehend. It was all precise geometry and deadly efficiency, a machine of production, met with another machine of destruction, us. I remember looking at Reed in the rear turret, his face tight with concentration, the red glow from the instrument panel casting strange shadows. Even in this moment, he was still singing softly to himself, a tiny defiance against the roaring violence surrounding us. Morgan's voice over the intercom was calm, mechanical, a guide through the madness. "Altitude steady. Flak to the starboard. Adjust bearing 2 degrees left." Time dilated. Seconds stretched into minutes. The city below was a living entity, writhing in fire, and yet indifferent to our passage. We were intruders, visitors in a place that had never asked for mercy, yet demanded all of ours. The moment to release the bombs came suddenly. Davis called out the final confirmation, and the bay doors opened with a mechanical groan. I glanced down at the city, at the patterns of streets and lights, at the human lives hidden beneath the chaos. And then, release. The bombs fell silently at first, like shadows detaching from the belly of the aircraft. Then the explosions began, distant and growing, a chorus of destruction that rolled across the landscape, shaking the aircraft gently as if it too mourned the devastation it had delivered. Fires bloomed in the streets, consuming buildings, casting a sickly glow that reflected on our faces through the cockpit glass. We were part of something vast, terrible, and unstoppable. The return flight was tense beyond measure. Searchlights hunted us across the sky like predators, and flak continued to erupt in violent showers, some rounds so close that sparks and shrapnel peppered the fuselage. We moved as one, silent except for the hum of engines and the occasional report of a gun. Every heartbeat, every breath, every micro-adjustment of the controls was magnified, vital. Somewhere over the North Sea, the chaos finally abated. The stars were the same stars as before, indifferent and distant, but now carrying the weight of what we had done. Morgan exhaled slowly beside me, and I realized we were both trembling, not from cold but from the sheer enormity of survival. No one spoke. Words seemed pointless. We were too exhausted, too haunted, too alive. When we landed back at the base, the engines wound down, ticking and cooling, leaving a hollow echo in the hangar. The ground crew cheered softly, the familiar rituals unfolding, but it all felt unreal. We climbed out of the aircraft, legs weak, heart still hammering, and I remember looking at the sky above Berlin, now far behind us, and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with altitude or wind. The city had changed me. You don't come back from such a place the same way you left. The night had a gravity of its own, heavier than any airfield, more suffocating than any hangar. And I realize for the first time that the sky above a city in flames carries a lesson, that life is fragile, fleeting, and that every decision we make in it can echo long after the engines fall silent. Even in sleep that night, I could hear the city burning, faintly, somewhere far beneath the moonlight. It was a sound that would stay with me forever, a reminder that the cost of the sky is always more than we can see. The nights after a mission were quiet, though never peaceful. We returned to the airfield with engines cooling and metal ticking like a heartbeat in the dark, yet my mind never slowed. Even in the bunk, even in the faint warmth of a wool blanket, I could still feel the hum of the Merlin engines beneath my skin, could still hear the echoes of anti-aircraft fire bouncing in the clouds above Berlin. Sleep came reluctantly, always interrupted by the memory of light below, of fire, of flak exploding like distant fireworks. It was during these hours that I found myself writing letters I never intended to send. Letters folded carefully, tucked into the lining of my flight jacket, full of thoughts I couldn't bear to speak aloud. Some were to my mother, though I never mailed them. I couldn't bear the thought of frightening her, of staining her quiet mornings with a knowledge of what I had seen, what I had done. Others were for my father, or perhaps for myself, words meant to survive in case I didn't. They were confessions, observations, small memories of laughter on the base, the taste of burnt tea in the mess hall, the soft hum of engines in the dark. I wrote because writing was a way to assert life, even when death seemed to hover over every decision, every breath. I remember one particular night, a letter addressed to no one in particular. The ink smudged as my hands shook from cold, from adrenaline, from fear. I flew over a city tonight, I wrote. A city that I cannot name without feeling the weight of the sky pressing down on me. Fires bloomed beneath us, like flowers made of smoke and flame. I am alive, but I am not the same. I do not know if I am supposed to be proud or ashamed. I hope you never see this, because it carries a truth too heavy for the world. I folded the paper and slipped it back into my jacket, feeling a small relief as if some of the tension had been transferred from my chest onto the page. The letters became a habit. Every mission added a new layer of words, a new weight of observation. Some nights, I wrote about my crew, their laughter, their quirks, the small ways they survived in the midst of unimaginable danger. Reed humming softly in the rear turret, Thompson whispering apologies to the engines, Morgan tracing routes over maps with meticulous precision. I wrote about them not because I expected anyone to read it, but because it was a way to anchor myself in a world that made little sense, a world where fire rained from the sky and the night could swallow you whole. Sometimes, I would imagine mailing the letters after the war, handing them to someone in a quiet room, letting them read and understand. But even then, I knew that the letters were for me, not for them. They were an echo of who I had been and who I feared becoming, a way to preserve a fragment of innocence in the midst of destruction. There were nights when the pens could not keep up with the thoughts, when my hands trembled too much to form letters that matched the intensity of what I felt. I would sit in the cockpit after a mission, staring at the instruments, the dials glowing faintly in red light, and write without stopping. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes a dry recounting of what had occurred, sometimes just words meant to fill the emptiness. The sky above me had seen too much, and I needed to speak, even silently, to feel human again. I never shared these letters with anyone. Not Reed, not Morgan, not even Thompson. We were all men burdened with our own thoughts, our own ghosts. Some things are better carried in silence. And yet, in the act of writing, I felt less alone, even though the world outside my bunk was indifferent, even though the night sky stretched infinite and unforgiving above our airfield. A letter never sent is like a memory frozen mid-thought. It exists in possibility, in hope, in fear. It carries the weight of things unsaid, of things too heavy to utter. And for me, it was a lifeline. A small thread connecting me to a world beyond the flak, beyond the fire, beyond the cold and the endless darkness. One morning, I awoke with ink-stained fingers and a pile of folded letters at my side. The sun was weak through the frost-covered windows. The air smelled faintly of fuel and cold metal. I knew another mission awaited. I knew the letters would remain unsent. But in that quiet, suspended moment, I felt a measure of peace. Even if the sky wanted to take everything, I had left a trace, a memory, a part of myself preserved on paper, a rebellion against the unrelenting weight of war. War teaches you to notice patterns where none exist, to read signs in shadows and listen for warnings in silence. And in those hours between missions, in the cold bunk of the airfield or the dark cockpit of the Lancaster, superstitions took root like weeds in the mind, growing unchecked in the fertile soil of fear. Our crew had them all. Some were small, almost laughable, like Morgan's insistence on always tracing the same route across the map 3 times before a mission. "I'm not taking chances," he'd say quietly, finger hovering over the chart. We all knew it was his way of controlling something he couldn't control: the sky, the enemy, the inevitable randomness of death. Thompson never let anyone touch his toolkit. "The engines respond to order," he said once, "and so must the hands that tend them." Reed carried a small silver charm, a tiny dog tag from a cousin who had died in France, tucked in the lining of his uniform. He would tap it thrice before climbing into the turret. Davis refused to step on cracks in the tarmac. He said it upset the balance of the mission. I, too, had my rituals. The yoke had to be adjusted in a certain way before takeoff, the oxygen mask strung precisely along the chest strap, my boots placed neatly side by side on the cockpit floor. A single deviation could unsettle me, though I knew rationally that the odds of a specific alignment affecting our survival were infinitesimal. Yet, superstition provided a measure of comfort, a sense of agency in a world dominated by randomness and death. Nightmares, of course, were inevitable. Sometimes they were simple, the hum of engines morphing into screams, the sky opening with flak bursting impossibly close, our aircraft disintegrating mid-flight. Sometimes they were more surreal, streets of Berlin shifting beneath us, lit with fires that danced in impossible patterns, people frozen mid-step, staring up at us as though they could see through the clouds into our souls. I woke drenched in sweat, shaking, the smell of smoke and burning metal clinging to my clothes as if the nightmare had followed me into the waking world. The crew had their own. Reed admitted once, after a particularly harrowing night over Hamburg, that he dreamed of tracer rounds as threads wrapping around his limbs, tightening until he could not move. Morgan confessed to seeing rivers of fire beneath him, cities collapsing in ways that didn't exist, all while the maps in his hands were impossible to read. Thompson's nightmares were quieter, more subtle, engines failing in silence, a whispering hum of metal that promised collapse. Davis saw patterns in the bombs he dropped, rows of streets transforming into faces, the buildings themselves staring back, accusatory and alive. Superstition and nightmares often intertwined. A black cat crossing the runway before takeoff could be taken as a warning. A streak of moonlight reflecting off the fuselage in a certain way might signal fortune or doom. We joked about them sometimes, but always quietly, careful not to invoke the wrong spirits. The airfield itself seemed to hum with unseen presence, shadows stretching unnaturally at night, the engines cooling in the hangars whispering secrets if you listened too closely. Some pilots swore the Lancasters were alive, that they recognized those who cared for them, and that machines could mourn the deaths of crews just as humans did. I laughed at first. I thought it nonsense. But the first time I heard the engine settle into a soft ticking after a mission, I swore I felt a pulse, a heartbeat beneath the metal. Nightmares were not confined to sleep. They came with the dark clouds of the North Sea, in flak bursts overhead, in the sudden flare of enemy searchlights. Even in the sunlit hangar, the memory of fire and tracer rounds haunted the eyes of my crew. We would exchange glances, subtle acknowledgments that the sky had not yet released us from its grasp. There was no shame in fear, it was merely a constant companion. And so, we lived between superstition and nightmare. We counted our rituals, repeated our prayers in the form of gestures, taps, placements, careful touches of instruments and knobs, anything to anchor us to life while the sky threatened to pull us into the unknown. Some nights, I would sit in the cockpit alone, long after the engines had cooled, tracing the instruments, whispering encouragement to the machine, wondering if it could sense the dread coiled in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to the bomber or to myself, or to the invisible specters that roamed above Europe with every mission. One thing became painfully clear: the line between superstition and survival blurred with every mission. What was ritual became instinct, what was nightmare became warning. And in the quiet hours before dawn, with frost on the airfield and the smell of cooling oil hanging in the hangars, we understood something fundamental. To survive the sky, you had to honor both the machinery and the shadows that accompanied it. Neither could be ignored. Because in the end, the night always remembers, and it is patient. And the sky never forgets. The first time flak exploded around us, it was as if the sky had turned against us. Not suddenly, but with a presence that made every heartbeat pound in my ears. I had read about anti-aircraft fire, had drilled endlessly in simulators, had memorized the sound of shells bursting at various altitudes. Yet no book, no practice, no warning could prepare you for the visceral reality. The metal tearing through air, the sudden flashes of light, the shrapnel showering sparks like miniature stars in every direction. We were approaching the Ruhr industrial region on our third mission, a labyrinth of factories and railways that seemed to pulse with life even as the war ground everything into motion. Morgan's voice over the intercom was calm but clipped, altitude steady. Bearing 270. Flak expected at 3,000 feet. I felt the Lancaster's wings tremble under my hands as we descended into the zone, engines humming steadily but vibrating through the fuselage as if aware of what awaited. Then it began. A single burst, high and bright, cutting through the night. Flak, starboard. Reed shouted from the rear turret. Orange blossoms of fire blossomed around us, some too close. I felt sparks of metal strike the fuselage, a shower of warnings we could not ignore. I gripped the yoke, twisting instinctively, adjusting pitch and roll in a desperate dance to avoid the worst. Thompson's hands flew over the engine controls, coaxing power and lift from tired Merlin engines that already strained under the weight of bombs and crew. We moved as one. Every man had a role, every sound, every flash, every vibration demanded immediate attention. Davis muttered coordinates, adjusting the bomb sight as we climbed higher, tracing the outline of the city through the haze of smoke and fire. Morgan guided us like a lifeline, reading the flak bursts ahead as if they were notes in a musical score, a deadly symphony that required perfection or death. Reed fired when he could, his turret glass glowing red in the dim light, tracking shadows that might be fighters or illusions, always vigilant. It was chaos, and yet strangely ordered. You learned to read the rhythm of danger, to anticipate the bursts, to trust the plane and the men around you. Each explosion made the aircraft tremble violently, yet it held together, wings screaming against the wind, engines roaring in defiance. I remember thinking, as we twisted through the sky, that the Lancaster was more than metal. It was a living thing, a guardian, a fragile cage of life that demanded respect. And the fire, the city seemed alive with it. Orange glows from bombed factories, street explosions, fires ignited by previous raids, combined with the tracer rounds streaking toward us. It was beautiful in a terrible way, a vision of destruction that made the stomach twist and the mind reel. Yet we had to focus. One misstep, one hesitation, and we could join the twisted fires below. Suddenly, a close burst tore along the starboard wing. Shrapnel pinged against the fuselage, a sound like glass breaking in midair. Reed cursed, checking his turret. Thompson adjusted the engines with precise, practiced motions, sweat running down his face despite the chill. I twisted the yoke, climbed slightly, then banked sharply, praying the next explosion would pass harmlessly. Morgan's voice was calm but firm. Steady, steady, hold her. I realized then that fear had a shape. It was not panic. It was sharp, electric, and precise. It focused every sense, every muscle, every thought. It made the difference between survival and death, and yet it was exhausting, a drain on body and mind that never fully dissipated, even after landing. The mission continued through flak zones, weaving in and out of bursts, the city below a shifting landscape of fire and shadow. The Lancaster shuddered, groaned, and responded to every input with a strange obedience. I became aware of every vibration, every hiss of wind over the fuselage, every minor sound that could signify disaster. Even a dropped tool, a misaligned lever, a cough in the wrong place could matter. When the bombs were finally released, Davis leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow, and muttered, "May God forgive us." The city below transformed instantly, lines of streets punctuated with sudden fires, factories shaking, rail lines disappearing beneath explosions. We climbed back into the night sky, engines roaring, flak still snapping around us like angry metal teeth, every man tense, every breath held. We did not speak much on the way home. Words seemed inadequate. We were alive, but the weight of survival pressed upon us like flak itself, invisible, unrelenting, and constant. Landing back at the base, the engines wound down, and I felt my body shake in ways I had not known before. The hum of the cooling metal, the ticking of the engine settling into silence, was a relief almost as profound as the act of surviving. Flak and fire left their mark, not on the metal of the plane alone, but on the mind and soul of everyone aboard. We had learned the lesson: the sky is not a place of glory, but of negotiation, compromise, and constant vigilance. Every mission was a conversation with death, and survival was the only proof that you had spoken correctly. Being a pilot was never just about flying. It was about responsibility. Every decision I made affected not only my life, but the lives of 6 other men, each one relying on my hands, my judgment, my ability to keep us alive in a world that seemed determined to extinguish us. Morgan, the navigator, trusted me to take us through treacherous skies, to interpret the maps correctly, to calculate course and altitude with precision. Reed, in the rear turret, counted on me to keep the aircraft steady, to anticipate threats that might emerge behind or above. Thompson, obsessively tending the engines, relied on me to manage power, to balance speed and altitude, to coax the metal beast through flak bursts and turbulence. Davis, with the bomb sight, depended on timing and trajectory, trusting me to keep us steady over targets we could barely comprehend from the sky. And then there were the others, the wireless operator, the flight engineer, each with their own role, each a delicate piece in a fragile mechanism. Responsibility weighed heavily, especially at night, when the sky was a void and every shadow could hide a hunter. The first moment you realize the weight is not when the bombs are dropped, but when you look around the cockpit, see the men who trust you, and understand that your choices dictate whether they live or die. It is a clarity that sharpens the mind and crushes the heart at the same time. I remember one night approaching Dusseldorf. Engines humming, flak bursting, searchlights probing the darkness. I glanced at Thompson adjusting the throttles. He did not speak, but his hands were steady. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he balanced fear and focus. Reed called out from the turret, and Morgan whispered adjustments for our course. All I had to do was integrate it, to see the patterns, anticipate the dangers, and act decisively. And yet, with every command came moral weight. Every target we approached, every bomb we dropped, carried consequences I could not ignore. I thought of the city below, of lives unfolding in those streets we would never walk, of families who would wake to destruction instead of dawn. Even in the darkened sky, thousands of feet above, the echoes of humanity pressed against my conscience. It was a strange duality, the exhilaration of mastery and control above the clouds, and the crushing awareness of destruction below. Decisions were never simple. Do we climb higher to avoid flak and risk oxygen depletion, or descend and risk the fury of anti-aircraft guns? Do we alter our course to avoid a suspected fighter patrol, even if it means being late on the bombing run? Do I push the crew to fly one more mission, knowing the toll it has taken, or refuse and risk judgment from higher command? The weight of command extended beyond tactical choices. It was in the way I treated the crew, the way I recognized fear and exhaustion, the way I acknowledged their silent courage. I learned to speak sparingly, to give orders with clarity, and to offer reassurance when words were necessary. A smile, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement, small gestures that meant life or death in the emotional sense, if not always the physical. I also carried their stories with me. Reed, the boy from Liverpool, who hummed to keep the monsters away. Morgan, meticulous and cautious, a man who mapped the world as if precision could ward off death. Thompson, a quiet engineer with hands that seemed to communicate with the engines themselves. Davis, haunted yet steady, carrying both calculation and conscience in equal measure. Every man was a universe, and I bore the responsibility of navigating them through the endless sky, threading a needle through fire and shadow. Command was a constant negotiation between logic and instinct, fear and resolve. A missed calculation could mean death, yet overthinking could be just as lethal. Sometimes I felt the sky weighing on my shoulders, pressing down with invisible fingers, reminding me that in this domain, responsibility is absolute, and mercy is rare. Landing after a mission brought temporary relief, but the weight did not lift. The engines cooled, the flak was behind us, the city distant, but my mind remained tethered to the lives I carried with me, to the decisions that had been made, and to the knowledge that the next night would bring another test. Command was not glory. It was vigilance, conscience, and endurance. It was the quiet understanding that survival depended on the careful orchestration of courage, skill, and sheer stubbornness. And the most important truth I learned: the sky does not forgive hesitation. The sky respects only those who carry the weight fully, without flinching, because lives depend on it. Even in sleep, I could not escape it. The decisions replayed themselves in dreams. Flak bursts, fires, the hum of engines, the faces of men who trusted me. And yet, each morning I awoke, knowing that to survive, I must bear it again, for the weight of command never truly lifts. There is a moment after a mission when the world seems to pause, a brief, suspended interval between chaos and the next inevitable storm. You land, engines cooling, tires crunching against frost-hardened tarmac, and the ground feels suddenly alive under your feet. You can breathe again, though the air tastes of fuel, sweat, and lingering fear. It is in these moments, brief as they are, that you realize life persists outside the cockpit, outside the sky, outside the roaring danger that has become your constant companion. We walked back from the airfield after one particularly harrowing raid over Hamburg, boots crunching through frost, breath visible in the frigid dawn. No one spoke much. Words seemed too heavy for the early morning. Yet in silence, there was understanding. The small gestures mattered: a pat on a shoulder, a shared cigarette, a glance that said, "We survived. For now." Breakfast in the mess hall was subdued. Tea was bitter, eggs overcooked, but we drank and ate anyway, because routine itself was a lifeline. Morgan meticulously laid out charts, tracing our next course in precise patterns. Thompson tinkered with the propeller blade, running his hands along it as if apologizing for the stress it had endured. Reed murmured quietly to himself, humming fragments of a song from home, and Davis scribbled something illegible on a small notebook, perhaps notes, perhaps prayers. These were our breaths between missions, the fragile spaces where fear subsided just enough for humanity to seep through. Letters we had written and never sent gathered in pockets and drawers, a quiet archive of thought and memory. I would often find myself staring at mine, ink smudged by sweat or trembling fingers, reading lines I had written in the air of the cockpit, letters that might never reach their intended eyes. We learned to find solace in small things. A stretch of frost-covered grass along the perimeter, the hum of distant engines warming in a hangar, the faint warmth of a wool blanket after a cold night, a shared joke that made the corners of our mouths lift despite exhaustion. Every gesture, every small comfort, became a tether to life outside the sky. Because in war, the sky demands everything, and anything you can claim for yourself, even for a brief breath, is precious. Sometimes, I would wander alone near the river that ran past the edge of the base. The water reflected the weak morning sun, fractured by ice in thin shards. I would think of home, of streets I had walked before the war, of the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, of the faint sound of voices that seemed impossibly distant. The contrast between the safety of the earth and the peril of the sky pressed against my chest in a strange, aching way. And yet, even in these moments of relative calm, there was always anticipation. We knew the next mission awaited. The hum of engines would call again. Searchlights would cut through the night. Flak would bloom in deadly bursts. and the fragile machinery of our lives would be tested once more. Between missions, there were conversations that mattered more than any briefing. We spoke quietly of what we had seen, the shapes of clouds, the glint of flak bursts, the patterns of cities in fire, and even the way the Lancaster responded to our touch. These discussions were rituals, a means of processing, of anchoring ourselves before the sky demanded attention again. Sleep was never complete. Even in the mess hall or on the bunks, I would hear the echo of engines, see flashes of flak in the corner of my eyes, feel the vibration of the aircraft beneath my hands. Dreams mingled with memory, with expectation, with fear. The night might offer rest, but it never offered forgetfulness. And yet, we endured. We found life in the spaces between missions, in the mundane details, in the subtle interactions, in small comforts. These moments were precious because they were fleeting. Each breath, each heartbeat, each glance at a comrade carried weight, a reminder that the world still existed beyond the cockpit, beyond the sky, beyond the roaring engines and deadly flak. It was in these fragile breaths, these intermissions of ordinary life, that we remembered who we were, and why it mattered to survive. Not for glory, not for medals, not for recognition, but for the simple, stubborn persistence of life. To breathe, to exist, to carry on. Because in the end, survival is not only measured by missions completed, but by the quiet insistence to live between them. Flying over the North Sea at night is a lesson in isolation. The water stretches endlessly beneath you, black and unknowable, reflecting nothing but the faint glimmer of stars and the occasional moonlight caught in gentle waves. There is no city to mark progress, no roads to guide your path, no warmth of human activity, only the cold, the dark, and the hum of engines as they carry you further from safety. On one mission, I remember climbing through cloud just past midnight, the frost on the wings glittering in the dim glow of the cockpit instruments. Morgan's eyes were sharp on the charts, reading lines and angles as if the North Sea itself could shift beneath us and warp our course. Reed hunched in his turret, peering into the night, fingers twitching over the triggers, listening for the faintest drone of an enemy fighter. Thompson checked gauges repeatedly, whispering assurances to himself and the engines alike. Even in such darkness, even with the cold seeping through our suits, there was an almost religious intensity to the crew's focus. The sea below is deceptive. Calm one moment, threatening the next. Clouds obscure your vision, ice forms on the wings, and the horizon melts into a void. Every instinct becomes magnified, every sound is scrutinized. The click of instruments, the faint creak of the fuselage, the distant howl of wind, each a possible omen, each a note in the symphony of tension that dominates a flight over the North Sea. Fear is constant. Not always sharp, like flak or enemy fighters, but steady gnawing, like a weight on your chest. The thought that a single miscalculation, a frozen control surface, an engine sputtering, could send you plummeting into the icy water below never leaves you. You learn to respect it, to let it sharpen focus rather than paralyze. Yet even respect cannot prevent the cold from creeping into bones, nor the mind from wandering to impossible questions. What would it feel like to hit the water? How long would we survive in that darkness? The sky itself seems hostile in these hours. Clouds swirl like phantom cities, winds twist with invisible fingers, and stars, so distant and unmoving, seem indifferent to the lives below. And yet, there is beauty in it too. The silver reflection of moonlight on black water, the way clouds glow faintly when engines cut across them, the soft hum of a Lancaster alive and thriving despite the desolation beneath. It is terrifying and beautiful at once, a paradox you carry with you for the rest of your life. During one particularly long flight, I watched the horizon for hours, a featureless line that could be the edge of the world. Reed spoke rarely, only whispering observations to himself, the hum of his voice lost in the wind and engines. Morgan adjusted our course with meticulous care, his hands steady despite the fatigue etched into his face. Thompson kept his vigil over the engines, listening to every vibration, coaxing them to continue, to survive with us, to carry us across the vast, indifferent sea. Isolation heightens every sound and every thought. A distant flare, a glint on the water, Even a shadow moving across the instruments can set nerves on edge. You become hyper-aware of everything, yet paradoxically aware of how small and fragile you are. The cold and dark press in from all sides, reminding you that life is provisional, and survival is never guaranteed. And yet, even in this desolation, camaraderie persists. A joke whispered quietly over the intercom, a glance shared between Morgan and me, the silent acknowledgement of Reed spinning in his turret. These are small miracles in the void. They tether you to reality, to humanity, to life itself. Without them, the North Sea would be an unending abyss, swallowing mind and spirit alike. Flight over the sea demands rhythm. Adjusting throttle, monitoring instruments, scanning the night for movement, checking coordinates against maps. It is a precise dance. Every error has consequences, every hesitation magnified. Even fatigue cannot excuse mistakes. And when you finally break free of the sea's black grip, approaching land, there is a deep, almost spiritual relief. The return to recognizable Earth is not joy, not celebration, but a quiet acknowledgement that life has, once again, granted a temporary reprieve. Yet the fear never leaves entirely. It lingers like a shadow at the edge of vision. Even when the coastline appears, familiar lights twinkling faintly in the distance, you know that the sea will be waiting for you again. And when night falls, it will be cold, dark, and infinite once more. And you, in your fragile machine of metal and courage, must meet it head-on. The horizon was always the first sign, a faint, almost imperceptible glow that marked the edges of our target cities. From hundreds of feet above, the industrial complexes and urban centers looked like nothing more than a constellation of human activity, carefully mapped lines and glowing pockets that hinted at the life below. But as we approached, the glow intensified, shadows and light mingling, smoke twisting into the night sky, and the reality of our mission became undeniable. We were about to deliver destruction on a scale that was impossible to comprehend from the ground. I remember the first time I saw the fires of Essen stretching across the horizon. The city was alive with heat, a shifting, breathing entity, and yet every flicker was a threat. Searchlights began to cut through the darkness, tracing arcs across the sky like skeletal fingers, and the first whispers of flak reached our ears as distant pops that quickly grew into violent eruptions. The crew became still in anticipation, every man focused, every nerve tuned to a single purpose: survival, precision, and cohesion. Morgan adjusted our course silently, lips pressed together as he traced the charts. 30 seconds to target, he said, barely above a whisper. I could see his fingers tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the tension of calculation, the impossible responsibility of threading a plane through fire and shadow. Davis was already adjusting the bomb sight, eyes narrowed, hands steady despite the vibration of the aircraft. Reed scanned the skies from his turret, red glow painting his face, scanning for fighters that could appear like phantoms from the clouds. The glow of the fires painted the clouds above in flickering orange and red, illuminating smoke that spiraled into shapes that played tricks on the mind. I caught myself staring for a moment, seeing streets stretch like molten rivers, imagining the lives unfolding below, and feeling an impossible weight press on my chest. The beauty was horrifying, the scale of destruction undeniable. And yet, we were compelled forward, instruments and instincts demanding that we press on, that we fulfill our mission. The first flak burst tore past us, a jagged bloom of metal that shook the fuselage violently. Thompson's hands flew over the engine controls, coaxing the Lancasters to climb slightly, to adjust speed, to avoid the worst. I twisted the yoke instinctively, feeling every vibration, every shudder, every response of the aircraft as if it were an extension of my own body. Flak was indiscriminate, merciless, a cruel reminder that the sky itself was hostile. And yet, there was rhythm in it, a terrifying, deadly rhythm. The crew moved with it, anticipating bursts, adjusting course, calling corrections in short, clipped commands that cut through the roar of engines and wind. Every second was magnified. Every micro-adjustment mattered. We had flown through night skies filled with clouds and cold, but nothing demanded attention like the first approach to the fires of a target city. Davis finally confirmed release. I felt the subtle shift of the aircraft as the bombs fell, the bay doors groaning with mechanical effort, and the city below transformed instantly. Lines of streets disappeared in bursts of orange and flame, factories twisted by fire, railways swallowed by sudden explosions. We climbed immediately, seeking altitude, watching the fires spread, feeling the flak eruptions intensify in retaliation. The flight back was tense, almost silent. Even after leaving the immediate danger, we remained alert, knowing that the return path could be just as lethal. Reed was quiet in his turret, Thompson meticulously checking gauges, Morgan tracing our course as if ensuring that no misstep would follow. We did not speak much. Words felt unnecessary, almost sacrilegious in the presence of what we had just witnessed. Yet the fires on the horizon lingered in the mind. Long after landing, even with engines ticking in the hangar and frost covering the tarmac, I would see them in dreams. A city glowing with destructive beauty, a landscape reshaped in moments, and the haunting awareness that the people below were as real as we were, as fragile as we were, as inevitable as death itself. The horizon had a message we could not ignore. The sky above these cities belonged to those who were willing to bear the weight of command, to thread their aircraft through fire and shadow, and to survive against impossible odds. And every mission confirmed that the price of the sky was always higher than anyone could truly measure. The first glimpse of a Messerschmitt in the fading glow of our target city felt like a blade cutting through the tension that had built up over hours of flight. One moment, the night was quiet, the roar of engines our only companion. The next, a shadow sliced across the sky, too fast, too precise, too alive. Reed's turret light glowed red as he swung toward the intruder, fingers ready, muscles tense, eyes trained to anticipate movement that was faster than thought. "Bandit at 2 o'clock high," he shouted, voice clipped, cutting through the hum of the engines and the drone of the wind. The Lancaster was not built for dogfights. It was a bomber, heavy, lumbering, dependent on formation, gunners, and careful planning to survive. Yet there we were, high above a burning city, confronted by fighters intent on tearing us apart. My hands tightened on the yoke, instinct screaming as I twisted, banked, and dove to present the smallest possible target profile. Thompson adjusted the throttles frantically, coaxing every ounce of power from the Merlin engines, listening to the hum and whine as if the plane itself knew the gravity of the situation. Flares from anti-aircraft fire below illuminated the sky in brief, violent bursts, painting the enemy in stark silhouettes. The Messerschmitts moved with lethal elegance, weaving through tracer rounds, diving and climbing with a precision that made our hearts race. Reed opened fire, tracer rounds streaking past the intruder, illuminating the dark, cold night with fleeting lines of light. I felt each movement, each adjustment, as if the Lancaster were an extension of my own body, every decision and negotiation with physics, fear, and fate. Morgan's voice came over the intercom, calm and precise despite the chaos. "Left bank 5 degrees. Adjust altitude 200 feet. Brace for attack from port side." I obeyed instinctively, trusting his calculations, trusting the years of experience and countless hours in simulators that now felt like a fraction of the real danger. The enemy's guns opened fire, tracers lancing through the air, some too close for comfort. A sharp ping rang out as shrapnel nicked the fuselage, sending sparks dancing across the metal skin. Time slowed. Each second stretched infinitely, filled with decision, reaction, and dread. The gunners fired, engines roared, flak burst below, and I guided our fragile machine through the violent ballet of survival. Every man on board moved in unspoken coordination, instincts honed by repetition and terror. There was no room for hesitation. A single lapse could mean the difference between life and death. The enemy made several passes, each one closer, each one more precise. I could feel the Lancaster shudder under near misses, its metal frame alive with stress. Reed cursed, firing continuously, while Thompson whispered reassurances to the engines, coaxing them to respond with precision. Morgan's calculations kept us aligned with the safest path, yet every burst of fire reminded us that luck, skill, and courage were only parts of survival. And then, a miracle of timing and coordination. The intruders broke off, distracted by another bomber in the formation, leaving us shaken but intact. The engines vibrated under my hands, a pulse of relief reverberating through the fuselage. I exhaled slowly, realizing that the crew's cohesion, our shared focus, and the relentless vigilance of each man had kept us alive once more. Even in retreat, the shadow of danger lingered. Every attack etched itself into memory, leaving indelible marks on the mind, a silent ledger of risk and survival. We continued over the burning city, wary of further engagement, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened. The sky had shown us its lethality in a form we could neither ignore nor outrun. It demanded respect, coordination, and courage, sometimes in ways that no preparation could fully instill. As the fires faded behind us and the enemy aircraft receded into the distance, a hush fell over the cockpit. Not relief exactly, but a fragile acknowledgement that we had survived the first true test of combat in the air. The shadow of the fighters would never leave us, lingering in the peripheral vision, in the heartbeat, in the quiet moments when engines cooled and we allowed ourselves to breathe. The sky had spoken. It had reminded us, sharply and without mercy, that above the fires, above the cities, above the North Sea, survival was never guaranteed, and that every second of life earned was a testament to the unspoken bond between crew, machine, and the cold, merciless heavens. The smoke rose like a living thing, curling and twisting from the burning city below, turning the night into a shifting labyrinth of gray and orange. We entered it cautiously, instruments alive with warnings, engines humming and straining, our Lancaster cutting through a fog that seemed more intent on swallowing us than any enemy fighter ever could. Visibility dropped to near nothing. The familiar outlines of buildings and streets dissolved into a chaotic haze of flame, ash, and shadow. Even the faint glow of fires became a threat, blinding and deceptive, reflecting off the smoke in ways that made it impossible to gauge distance or altitude with certainty. Morgan's voice came over the intercom, clipped but calm, guiding us through the turbulence. Altitude steady. Adjust heading 2 degrees port. Watch for downdrafts. I followed his instructions, but the smoke had a weight to it, pressing against the fuselage, distorting perception, making the sky seem denser, heavier, alive in its own way. Every instinct screamed caution, yet we had a mission to complete, bombs to release, and a fragile crew depending on precise maneuvering. Reed's turret light flickered through the haze, red against gray, as he scanned for fighters that could appear without warning. The smoke seemed to swallow even the sound of engines, muffling the world, making it feel as though we had been transported into an alternate dimension where rules were different, and danger more insidious. Thompson monitored the engines obsessively, noting every variation in RPM, every vibration, every warning signal. In the smoke, even minor fluctuations could be fatal. Ice could form unnoticed on wings or propellers, instruments could mislead, and the horizon, our constant reference, was gone. Flying through the smoke required trust beyond calculation. Trust in Morgan's navigation, trust in Reed's vigilance, trust in Thompson's control of the engines, trust in Davis to release the bombs at the correct moment despite the distortion of visual markers, and trust in my own instincts, honed by countless missions, to keep the Lancaster steady through a sky that refused to behave predictably. The smoke created its own wind currents, twisting and shifting unpredictably, buffeting the fuselage, forcing continuous adjustment. I felt each shudder, each tremor, each subtle tilt, as if the Lancaster were alive and struggling against an invisible adversary. We dipped slightly, then climbed, rolled to avoid denser pockets of smoke, and yet there was no comfort in movement. The horizon offered no reassurance, only the uncertainty of endless gray. It was disorienting. Moments stretched and bent. Time seemed to dissolve in the haze. You felt suspended, neither fully in control nor fully at the mercy of the elements, a fragile participant in a sky that was indifferent to human lives. Even our instruments, though reliable, could not convey the full sensation of movement, turbulence, or proximity. We relied on intuition and the subtle cues of the aircraft's responses, minute vibrations that spoke volumes to those who listened. And then came the fires themselves, suddenly erupting into visibility, twisting the smoke into chaotic columns of flame and ash. Bombs dropped by earlier waves ignited secondary explosions, creating new hazards that could tear through wings and fuselage without warning. We threaded between them, timing every adjustment with precision, feeling the heat of the flames as if it pressed against the plane itself. The smell of smoke, of burning metal, of the city below, crept even through the enclosed cockpit, reminding us in the most primal way that life and death were interwoven in every moment. Yet there was beauty amidst terror. The flames painted the clouds above with impossible colors, orange and red bleeding into gray, dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. The smoke swirled and twisted like living ink, a chaotic painting of war, destruction, and survival. Even as our hearts pounded, even as every nerve screamed tension, I could not look away, captivated by the raw, overwhelming power of what we witnessed. We emerged from the densest clouds finally, instruments readjusted, visibility returning, the horizon slowly revealing itself again. The crew exhaled almost simultaneously, a shared, unspoken relief coursing through us. We had survived another test, threaded another impossible needle. But even in safety, the weight lingered. The memory of swirling smoke, the deceptive calm, the sense that the sky itself had been testing us, and that it had not been entirely satisfied. Flying through clouds of smoke taught us more than navigation. It taught patience, awareness, humility, and the necessity of complete trust in each other in the plane, and in the fragile thread of fate that held life together above a burning world. And it left an impression that would never fade. The sky is beautiful, but it is also merciless, and the line between survival and catastrophe can vanish in an instant. The flight home is never quiet, though it may appear so from the outside. Engines hum, instruments tick, and the wind whispers along the fuselage, but the real noise is in your head, the unspoken tally of flak bursts, fighter shadows, missed markers, and split-second decisions that determine survival or death. It is a silence loaded with thought, tension, and the faint, lingering echo of the city left behind in flames. Morgan checked our coordinates repeatedly, tracing lines on the charts with precision, though the quiver in his hands betrayed the strain. Reed sat in his turret, scanning as always, but his gaze occasionally drifted to the ground below, perhaps imagining what remained of the streets and buildings we had passed. Thompson's hands never left the engine controls. Even in safe skies, he seemed to commune with the machinery, coaxing reliability from components that had already endured more than any man could ask. Davis leaned against the bombardier's station, silent, contemplative, counting off the seconds since release, calculating whether our trajectory would keep us free of remaining threats. I too felt the weight. Piloting a heavy Lancaster over hundreds of miles is both mechanical and moral. Every vibration, every change in altitude, every glance at instruments carries the memory of the mission, and the possibility that one mistake could undo the fragile thread holding us together. The city's fires faded into the distance, yet their glow persisted in the mind, a spectral reminder of the destruction wrought, of the human lives intersected with our duty, of the indiscriminate consequences of war. The North Sea stretched beneath us, dark, calm, and endless, a cold corridor separating us from safety. Even over water, fear remained. Engines could fail, altitudes could drop suddenly, and a night landing at a distant airfield could become a perilous gamble. We scanned the horizon constantly, not expecting anything, but knowing that the sky could betray at any moment. The silence of the crew was not emptiness. It was the focus of survival, a mutual understanding that words could not enhance the precision required for the return. Fatigue pressed heavily. Muscles ached from hours of tension, fingers cramped from gripping controls, eyes strained from scanning and calculation. Yet exhaustion was a luxury we could not afford. Every adjustment of the yoke, every check of instruments, every minute correction demanded attention, and even small lapses could be fatal. Sleep, though it beckoned, could not be indulged until the wheels touched tarmac and engines wound down. The base began to appear on the horizon, faint clusters of lights piercing the darkness, flickering like distant stars. Even in these moments, anticipation and anxiety surged. Landing is deceptively dangerous, particularly after a night mission. The ground can appear closer or farther than it is. Crosswinds bite at the wings. Fatigue dulls reflexes. and the knowledge that the mission's success hangs on your hands presses upon the chest like a physical weight. As we descended, Morgan guided us through final approach, his voice calm but resolute. Hold altitude. Watch alignment. Adjust for crosswind. I felt every vibration through the fuselage, every subtle tug of wind, every twitch of the yoke, translating instinct into action. Reed and Davis maintained watch, every sense alert, every hand ready. Thompson monitored the engines like a physician tending to a patient on life support. The lights of the runway grew, and my pulse quickened, a mix of relief and tension. We had survived the mission, but the final moments demanded focus just as acutely as anything we had faced over the city or the North Sea. Engines roared as we lined up, instruments flashing and needles quivering, and for a brief instant, the world contracted to the metal under my hands, the hum of the Lancaster, and the coordination of the crew that had shared this journey. Wheels touched tarmac with a jolt, landing gear absorbing the impact. Engines began to wind down, propellers slowing, the vibrations easing into quiet ticking. We had returned, alive yet exhausted, each man silently absorbing the weight of the night's events. The airfield was calm, deceptively so, the night holding no trace of the infernos we had left behind or the dangers we had survived. But the memory of flak, fire, and fighter shadows lingered, etched into minds, bodies, and the fragile machinery that had carried us through. Even after shutdown, the silence was heavy. Not merely relief, but a deep, reflective stillness, the kind that follows surviving events impossible to fully articulate. The mission was complete, yet its echoes would follow us, through the hangars, along the frost-covered runways, into dreams, and into the inevitable anticipation of the next sortie. Survival was never simple. It was a collection of small victories, precise decisions, and trust, in men, in machines, and in the fragile thread of fortune that allows one more night to end with a faint click of cooling engines and the quiet assurance of solid ground beneath your feet. In the fragile calm between missions, letters became a lifeline, a tether to a world that seemed impossibly distant yet achingly familiar. I would sit in the dim light of the mess hall or in the corner of a bunk, pen in hand, staring at a sheet of paper as if it could carry not just words, but the essence of who I was beyond the cockpit. Each letter was a small act of defiance, a way to insist that life and humanity persisted even amidst fire, flak, and the relentless roar of engines. Receiving letters was a ritual of cautious anticipation. A slip of paper from home, often smudged, folded unevenly, carried news of birthdays, of ordinary meals, of streets still standing and faces still smiling. I would read slowly, absorbing details that had no bearing on the mission yet filled a void that combat could never occupy. Morgan passed letters silently to Reed, who would read them twice before tucking them carefully away. Thompson, meticulous as ever, would inspect each envelope for tears or smudges before reading, a small expression of control in a life otherwise defined by uncertainty. Writing letters was harder. I never knew if they would arrive, if the words would make sense, if the people on the other side could imagine the reality of our world. I wrote about small things, the way frost formed on the cockpit windows, the hum of the engines, the patterns of clouds over the North Sea. I avoided the most terrifying truths, flak, fighters, fires, not out of cowardice, but because some realities were too heavy to lay on those who had no choice but to stay behind. Yet every line carried longing, a silent acknowledgement that somewhere, someone was waiting, and that our survival mattered beyond the mission, beyond the war, beyond even the sky itself. I remember one evening, after a grueling sortie over Essen, sitting in the quiet mess hall with a pencil trembling in my hand. I wrote to my younger brother, describing the night sky, the cold, the subtle way moonlight reflected off frost on the wings. I told him of the camaraderie, the trust, the tiny victories that allowed us to return home alive. And yet, I could not bring myself to write of the fires, of the city below, of the shadows of fighters that haunted every flight. There were truths too heavy to send in ink, truths that could only be carried in the mind, in the cockpit, in the quiet after the engines wind down. Reading letters from home brought warmth that was almost unbearable in its contrast to the cold, mechanical reality of the airfield. I would trace the words with my fingers, imagining the faces of the writers, The smell of familiar rooms, the softness of blankets, the sound of voices that had become almost mythical in their absence. Even Morgan, who rarely displayed emotion openly, would pause over a folded letter, lips pressed together, eyes distant yet focused, carrying a personal moment of connection that reminded him, and all of us, of what we were fighting to preserve. These letters also carried guilt. Guilt for being away, for facing danger while others remained behind, for surviving when the world below did not. Each word was a reminder of distance, of separation, of the impossible task of maintaining humanity while immersed in destruction. Yet they also carried hope, faint and persistent, like a single star seen through a thinning layer of cloud. In the quiet, I imagined the recipients reading my letters, wondering if my words could convey the texture of fear and courage, the intimacy of small moments, the fragile thread of life in a sky that demanded constant vigilance. Sometimes I imagined them smiling, sometimes worrying, sometimes sighing with relief that I had survived another night. And in those imaginings I found strength. Strength to climb back into the cockpit, strength to trust the crew, strength to thread through the fires and flak awaiting us on the next mission. Letters from home were more than words. They were anchors, reminders of who we were beyond the machines we piloted, beyond the missions, beyond the night skies that threatened to swallow us whole. They were fragments of life preserved, proof that even in a world dominated by war, human connection could survive, could endure, and could carry us through the darkest hours. And so, after reading and writing, after folding the papers and tucking them carefully into pockets or envelopes, we returned to our duties. The letters faded into the background, yet their presence lingered, a quiet hum beneath the roar of engines, a reminder that we fought not just for victory, but for the fragile, precious threads of life and love that existed beyond the horizon. Fatigue is a predator that moves silently through the cockpit, invisible yet insistent, gnawing at the edges of concentration, twisting reality into something unrecognizable. Hours of flight, repeated missions, cold seeping into bones, tension vibrating through every nerve, all combine to create a haze where the line between wakefulness and nightmare blurs. Even when on the ground, the mind refuses to rest. Images and sounds from the sky replay endlessly, like a film projected on the inside of your skull. I often found myself lying in the bunk, eyes closed, yet unable to escape the sky. The hum of engines became a drone in my ears, flak bursts echoed like percussion in dreams, and the shadows of fighters danced across the ceiling as if pursuing me even in sleep. I would awaken with hands trembling, heart hammering, convinced for a moment that the cockpit still enveloped me, that the fuselage groaned under invisible weight, that enemy planes had appeared out of nowhere. Even the faintest sound in the mess hall, the click of a radiator, the rustle of canvas, would set the mind alight with imagined threats. Sometimes the dreams were vivid reenactments of missions. Flying over a burning city, engines screaming, flak tearing the sky apart, Reed shouting from the turret, Thompson adjusting throttles, Morgan calculating course, all in a looping nightmare that replayed the terror in heightened, almost surreal detail. I could feel the heat of explosions, the pull of sudden dives, the vibration of near misses, and the smell of smoke and oil so intense that even waking could not dispel it. Other nights, the nightmares were more abstract, more psychological. I would drift above featureless clouds, unable to find horizon or reference, suspended in a void where time did not exist. The Lancaster became less a machine and more a living thing, groaning, trembling, threatening to collapse at any moment. I felt as though I were falling endlessly, the ground both impossibly distant and impossibly close, the sky a swirling canvas of fire, ice, and shadow. In these dreams, the fear was not of the enemy, but of helplessness, the inability to act, to control, to save the crew or myself. Waking from these nightmares brought no comfort. The day demanded alertness, coordination, and courage, even as the mind carried remnants of the night's terror. Sometimes I would sit on the edge of a bunk, staring at the dim light, fingers tracing the seams of letters from home, and wonder how anyone could endure this without fragmenting. The camaraderie of the crew, the trust and rhythm we had developed in the sky, became our lifeline, a fragile tether to sanity and purpose. Fatigue and fear mingled with guilt. Guilt for surviving when so many did not, guilt for leaving home, guilt for the destruction wrought on the cities below. In dreams, these emotions amplified, making each sortie not only a physical trial but an existential one. Yet nightmares also forced reflection. They revealed the constant presence of mortality, the fine edge we walked, and the intricate balance required to maintain focus, courage, and humanity amidst the chaos. I began to notice patterns, small cues that the mind gave when approaching its breaking point: the sudden tightness in the chest, the twitching of hands, the subtle hesitation in decision-making. I learned to listen, to breathe, to anchor myself to the instruments, to the crew, to reality, a practice in mindfulness born of necessity. Morgan, too, would pause, silently observing, his quiet awareness a subtle guide for all of us. Even Reed and Thompson, who rarely spoke of fear, moved with a cautious rhythm, a small collective defense against mental collapse. Nightmares above the clouds were a shadow of the sky itself, relentless, unpredictable, and inescapable. They reminded us that the war was not only fought with engines, flak, and bullets, but also in the mind, in the unseen spaces where courage and terror intertwined. And in this quiet terror, a strange clarity emerged. Survival required more than skill or luck. It demanded presence, discipline, trust, and an unyielding commitment to endure even when the night refused to end. Even in wakefulness, these shadows lingered, whispering reminders of mortality and responsibility, ensuring that every decision, every maneuver, every heartbeat in the sky was both conscious and deliberate. They were an unwelcome teacher, yet one whose lessons were impossible to ignore. And for those of us above the clouds, they became as much a part of life as the roar of engines, the touch of frost, and the hum of instruments guiding us through fire and darkness. Dawn arrived slowly over the airfield, pale and hesitant, like a timid observer of the chaos that has unfolded through the night. The frost clings to the wings of the Lancasters, turning them into fragile sculptures of ice and metal, glittering under the weak light. The engines, once roaring and alive, tick and hum as they cool, releasing the last of their heat into the crisp morning air. There is a stillness now, a silence that is not peace but the fragile breathing space between danger and the next inevitable call to the sky. We stumble from the aircraft, bodies stiff, muscles aching, minds still partially suspended in the night's memories. Thompson stretches, cracking joints that protest after hours of tension, while Morgan inspects the engines one last time, fingers tracing familiar contours as if confirming the machine's survival alongside our own. Reed leans against the fuselage, turret empty, eyes scanning the horizon absent-mindedly, perhaps imagining the shadows that might appear if only he could see them. Davis collects his gear quietly, cataloging, adjusting, preparing for the next sortie even before breakfast is served. The air is sharp with frost, carrying the faint tang of oil and smoke from the night's mission. It mingles with the smell of damp earth and distant morning fires from towns that survived the raids, creating a strange cocktail that only airmen recognize, a perfume of survival, danger, and endurance. I breathe it in deeply, letting it anchor me, reminding me that we have returned from the fires, from the flak, from the fighters, from the endless expanse of night. We gather in the mess hall, subdued. Breakfast is eaten quietly, each bite measured, each sip of tea savored for warmth more than taste. The conversation is minimal, a quiet recounting of incidents, a brief observation of ice on wings, a murmured acknowledgement of skill and luck that spared us once again. Yet even in this calm, there is tension. We all know that the night will come again, that the horizon will glow with fires, that flak and fighters will return, and that the fragile reprieve of dawn is always temporary. I take a moment to step outside, watching the sun begin to pale the horizon, brushing it with muted gold. The runway stretches out, long and empty, dotted with frost and footprints. Aircraft sit in silence, their forms outlined in cold light, shadows stretching across the tarmac. The world seems almost peaceful, and yet every instinct tells me this is an illusion, a momentary pause in an unending storm. Fatigue presses harder in these early hours than during flight. The mind begins to untangle from the adrenaline, and every muscle remembers the tension it endured. Yet the emotional weight emerges now, thoughts of letters from home, the cities left burning, the shadows of enemy fighters, the faces of the crew, and the knowledge that the night will call again. Even the laughter shared over small mundane jokes in the mess hall carries undercurrents of exhaustion and fear, a delicate balance of relief and apprehension. Dawn brings with it reflection. The fires, the smoke, the flak, and the enemy have all retreated into memory, yet they leave marks, subtle, permanent. Memories of instruments vibrating under pressure, tracers streaking across the night, clouds twisting in unholy shapes, engines screaming in protest. All etch themselves into consciousness, reminders of what has been endured and what will inevitably be faced again. We walk the airfield, boots crunching against frost, sharing glances and small gestures of solidarity. A pat on the shoulder, a quiet nod, a shared cigarette, each action reinforcing a bond forged in the crucible of night sorties. It is in these small connections that we find strength, courage, and sanity, a tether to life outside the sky, outside the engines, outside the relentless demands of survival. The cold morning does not comfort, but it clarifies. It reminds us that life continues, that the world persists beyond the missions, and that our survival carries weight beyond mere existence. It is a pause, fleeting and fragile, but essential, a space to breathe, to reflect, and to prepare, mentally, physically, and emotionally, for the inevitable return to the sky. And in that moment, as the sun weakly brushes the horizon and frost glints along the wings, there is a quiet understanding among us. We have survived another night. We have endured, despite fear, fatigue, and the merciless demands of the sky. But survival is temporary, and the horizon, always, waits with new challenges, new dangers, and new tests of courage, skill, and the fragile bonds that hold us together. The hangar smelled of oil, fuel, and metal, a familiar scent that settled into the lungs like a second skin. Even in the calm of daylight, the whisper of engines in the distance seemed to hum beneath everything, a constant reminder that the sky was never quiet for long. We moved among the aircraft with deliberate precision, checking instruments, inspecting wings, verifying controls, each motion a ritual of survival and preparation. The Lancaster, heavy and intricate, seemed almost alive under our hands, its metal frame vibrating faintly, a subtle anticipation of the night to come. Morgan was already tracing the flight path, charting the approach with meticulous care, his eyes scanning for potential hazards, enemy positions, and the safest corridors through cloud and darkness. Reed tested turret rotation, dry-firing rounds against invisible threats, each click and recoil a quiet reassurance that he could meet any challenge that arrived unannounced. Thompson monitored engines, coaxing each to life, listening to subtle purrs and vibrations that spoke louder than any words. Even Davis, in the bombardier station, ran through mental calculations, tracing lines on charts, imagining the city layouts, and rehearsing timing in a world that demanded split-second precision. We all felt the same tension, unspoken but pervasive, the inevitable return to the night. The horizon would soon darken, clouds would gather, flak would bloom, and fighters would shadow our path. The whisper of engines, both here on the ground as others prepared for flight and in memory of missions already flown, was a haunting prelude, a quiet voice reminding us that the sky's challenges never ceased. Every adjustment, every check, every whispered confirmation was a dance with fate, a small exertion against the unpredictable, merciless demands of war. I ran my hands along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal beneath my gloves, and imagined the hours to come. The engines would roar to life, vibrating through every bone and nerve. The night sky would stretch out endlessly, cold and indifferent, filled with shadows and fire. We would thread through flak and fighters, clouds and smoke, following the same patterns that had become almost ritualistic yet were always lethal. And through it all, survival would depend on trust, precision, and instinct, and on the fragile understanding that every heartbeat mattered. There is a strange rhythm in these preparations, a cadence that merges caution, anticipation, and readiness. We speak in clipped sentences, gestures, and glances, communicating a wealth of information in the smallest motions. A nod signals readiness, a hand points toward a gauge, a glance acknowledges danger, the language of survival above the clouds, honed by countless sorties and endless repetition. It is both mechanical and deeply human, a symphony of instinct, experience, and awareness that binds crew to machine and crew to crew. Even in these hours of waiting, the mind drifts. I imagine the cities below, the fires we have left smoldering in memory, the innocents whose lives intersected with our duties, the families waiting for letters that may never arrive. I think of letters from home, of frost on wings, of the night skies alive with flak and fighter shadows. And I consider the delicate balance of courage and fear, of duty and mortality, that defines every moment in the air. The engines whisper again, faint hums in the hangar, prelude to their true roar in the darkness. It is a call we cannot ignore, a siren of inevitability. Soon we will climb, tracing paths through clouds, fire and shadow, threading our fragile machine through the sky with lives and duty intertwined. The weight of the horizon presses, the cold stretches its fingers, and the night waits. I take a deep breath, fingers steady on controls that do not yet move, eyes tracing lines on charts, mind rehearsing instincts that will guide us through the coming hours. The crew stands ready, a fragile human chain linked by experience, trust, and necessity. And as the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the frost, we listen to the whisper of engines and know that the sky will call us again, relentless and indifferent, yet full of purpose. The night is approaching, and soon we will answer.